In May 2025, several ground stations for the European Space Agency, the ESA, suddenly lost contact with a cluster of Earth observation satellites. At first, the engineers thought it was a solar flare or a hardware glitch.
But when the forensics teams dug into the logs, they found something that didn't make sense. The command to deorbit the sensors, essentially blinding the satellites, didn't come from a Russian GRU server, military intelligence, and it didn't come from a Chinese MSS terminal.
In fact, it came from both.
The initial breach used a classic Chinese Typhoon botnet of home routers to gain access. It's quite mind-spinning, isn't it? People's home routers accessing satellites. The payload, the poison, the nasty bit, that actually disabled the systems was a modified version of AcidRain, a piece of wiper malware famously used by Russia during the invasion of the Ukraine.
And this was the smoking gun that the intelligence community had been fearing since 2022. This was no coincidence. It was a joint operation.
For years, China and Russia were like two rival gangs. They stayed out of each other's way, but they didn't share tools. In 2025 and 2026, those walls have come down. The No Limits partnership has officially entered the digital trenches.
I'm Tova, Dvorin, your host, and welcome back to the Safe Breach Studios for the Cyber Resilience Brief, a Safe Breach podcast.
And I'm Adrian, Culley, your co-host. Welcome back to our Dragon's Digital Shadow series, the China Deep Dive. This is episode 5, The Axis of Disruption.
That's right. Today we are looking at the axis of disruption, that is the deepening and the often terrifying cooperation between the hackers of Beijing and Moscow. Now, Adrian, let's go back to February 2022, right before the invasion of Ukraine, or at least this decade's invasion of Ukraine. Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin declared a no-limits partnership. Now, at the time, we thought about tanks, gas, grains, but the cybersecurity implications were the real long-term threat.
Absolutely, Tova. You see, historically, their hijacking styles were polar opposites. Russia, specifically military intelligence, the GRU, foreign intelligence, the SVR, were like a sledgehammer, very rough, and they just wanted to break things, cause chaos, leave a mess, destroy and disrupt. Think of the 2017, nearly 10 years ago, NotPetya attack, or the 2015 Ukraine power grid attack.
Yeah, wild that was 10 years ago. And in the meantime, China was a data vacuum cleaner. They wanted to be quiet, stay in for years, and suction up every bit of intellectual property they could find until they were ready to act.
Exactly that, Tova. But by 2025, their goals had converged. Russia needed more sophisticated living off the land infrastructure to bypass Western sanctions and improve defences. China, on the other hand, realised that if they were ever to move on Taiwan, they need to know how to use wiper malware, the sledgehammer, to paralyse the US response.
And so they started a trade program, or you could call it an exchange program, with Russia.
That's a great way to put it. In late 2025, we saw Chinese threat actors, specifically our frenemies APT41, using Russian-designed exploit kits to target European government ministries. Meanwhile, the Russian actors were spotted using the KV botnet, that massive network of American home routers we talked about in episode 2 of this series, to mask their traffic.
And this is a marriage of convenience. China provides the scale and the cloak, and Russia provides the dagger and the combat-tested destructive code.
And we'll be right back.
You know, Adrian, we've also seen a shift in how they handle 0 days. This is a reminder, 0 days are those unpacked software vulnerabilities that have never been seen before. That's why it's called a 0 day. Now, Adrian, remember that new 2026 law in China that we discussed in our very first episode on the Chinese Threat Actor series? Let's do a quick recap for our listeners of what that means for 0 days in 2026.
So it's the engine of this whole new axis. Remember, under the new law, Chinese researchers must report vulnerabilities to the Chinese Ministry of State Security first, before anybody else. And until they get given permission from the Chinese Ministry of Security, they cannot disclose them outside of China or even inside of China to any other party.
Right, and that's for 72 hours. And now there are reports that the Ministry of State Security is leaking some of these vulnerabilities to their counterparts in the Russian sphere before they are ever patched.
Exactly. That's the eye of the storm here. It's exactly why they've enacted this law in the first place. It's a vulnerability exchange. We saw this in just recent weeks, January 2026, a major vulnerability in a common enterprise VPN. Before the company could even release a patch, we saw simultaneous attacks from Chinese and Russian groups hitting different sectors of the US government.
This was a pincer move. China went for the data, the perception dominance we've talked about in the past, and Russia went for the persistence, setting up backdoors for future disruption. It's a complete role switch.
And they're sharing more than just code, they're sharing infrastructure. In 2025, investigators found a shared command and control server in a neutral third country data center. It was being used by both a Chinese link group and a Russian link group to manage their respective botnets.
Wow, that's like two different intelligence agencies sharing the same safe house. It shows a level of trust, or at least a level of integrated planning, that we haven't seen since the Cold War.
And we'll be right back.
Now let's go back to the European Space Agency breach we talked about in our intro. That felt like a coming out party for this new alliance.
It really was. The target was the Galileo satellite system. And for those of you outside of Europe who may not be familiar with that name, it's Europe's GPS satellite system.
But why would China and Russia team up to attack Europe's satellite system?
Tova, blinding a satellite system is incredibly hard to do from a keyboard. You need two things. You need access to the ground control stations, which isn't intuitive. You don't go straight to the satellites. You need to penetrate and compromise the ground control stations first. Turns out China is very good at getting into those. And then you need the wiper code to go into space and corrupt the satellite's firmware, which Russia has actually perfected.
So the Chinese group, likely a cell from Volt Typhoon, got the credentials. And then they sat there for months quietly mapping the network.
Exactly. Our frenemy Volt Typhoon, who again we've got excellent coverage of. But then, when the moment was right, likely to coincide with a major military exercise in the Baltic as it happens, they handed the keys over to the Russian team. The Russians injected the wiper code, and boom, the satellites went into safe mode. They weren't destroyed, but they were useless for 48 hours. Disruption.
You know, it's almost like a real life and very scary version of Capture the Flag and a relay race all rolled into one. And it's crucial because that 48-hour window is exactly what a military would need to move troops or ships without being seen from space.
It's beyond a proof of concept. It's demonstrated a significant capability when deployed as part of other military actions, such as at the start of physical war, kinetic activity. It showed that the axis of disruption can effectively blind the West's eyes in the sky whenever they choose.
Now, Adrian, are you able to expand for us how that was resolved, if at all? Are there any defenses in place now?
There are, and there were firmware patches issued, and there was significant target hardening undertaken at the ground stations. The challenge is with the Chinese speciality of low and slow and lurking in the background, flushing out attackers that have penetrated years ago is not trivial. It's time consuming, and we talk regularly about reversing the adversary advantage. In these scenarios, they do have an advantage, and if they know something that we don't know, we're literally looking for a black cat in a black room that may or may not be there. But there's been extensive activity. The agencies responsible who owned satellites, including USA and Europe, the Allies, have undertaken extensive work to try and reassure the government at the highest levels that this problem won't occur again. However, that's a difficult guarantee to give.
Oh, that makes sense. It's the Schrodinger's cat of threat actors. But that's not the nightmare scenario, is it? You know, as we look towards the rest of 2026, what is the nightmare scenario for this year?
So, you're quite right. Scarily, the nightmare is coordinated sabotage. Imagine a scenario where China decides to make a move on Taiwan, which they've sort of publicly said they're going to do in 2027. It's not that long away, weeks away. At the exact same time, imagine Russia launches a massive cyber offensive against the European energy grid. And they're already doing that.
Right.
Russia's already attacking the European energy grid. But imagine if at the same time as the European energy grid, they also attack the US telecommunications backbone. And we know that Salt Typhoon is in the US telecommunications backbone. China's actually penetrated one of the most secret government programs in America, their lawful interception program. All this preparation is there in place.
Yikes. And that means in such a situation, the US is going to be too busy trying to get its power back on and its phones working to even think about deploying a carrier strike group to the Pacific.
Exactly. It's a saturation attack, long established over the 20th century, if not way before them. Warfare on two simultaneous fronts is not a good idea. You overwhelm the defenders by hitting everything at once from two different directions using a mix of techniques that make attribution, deciding who to blame, nearly impossible. We've actually seen a new attack disclosed by Mandiant and Dell, well, initially by Dell, then Mandiant researchers, called Grimbolt today, which actually is showing cutting-edge hacking against Dell servers, the VMware servers that have a rather unfortunately hard-coded credential that the Chinese Secret Service have managed to uncover. What they do is they create a ghost NIC. We'll do a later episode about this, but it's very fascinating. They're creating a virtual network card on the virtual machine. They then use that to penetrate the operational technology and lateral movement, living in the blind spot, which we talked about. This is cutting edge living in the blind spot. But then they forensically wipe. Back to the satellite problem. How do we know if we found them? They're actively covering their tracks at every step. And that makes it a challenge. We're seeing this as we speak. Grimbolt's been disclosed yesterday. It's a CVSS score of 10, the most serious thing. It ties in. We already know the Chinese Brickstorm actors are using it, and you're likely to hear a lot more of this in the coming days, weeks, and months.
Wow, so we'll keep our listeners updated.
And we'll be right back.
And zooming out for a second, overall, if there's a large-scale attack that uses Chinese botnets, but also Russian malware, who exactly do you retaliate against? One, both, the entire Crink nexus? What do you do?
So Crink's a very pertinent, apposite term to be using here, Tova. There's a grey zone, and that's deliberately constructed. It's not accidental. They want us to be in this grey zone where we're uncertain. It's a fear, uncertainty, and doubt. FUD. It's a key component psychologically of intelligence agency disruptive behaviour. They want a state of permanent uncertainty where we're constantly reacting to ghosts. But it doesn't have to be that way.
No, it doesn't. And why doesn't it have to be that way? Because if you're using an adversarial exposure validation tool, if you're keeping an eye on where you might be vulnerable and are constantly trying to validate your security tools, then you're in a good place. I mean, just speaking of safe breach for a second, we do have considerable coverage of Chinese APT41's TTPs and offensive code, plus APTs 28, 29, and 40 from Russia. Remember, hack yourself before they do. Remediate and plug the gaps, and develop a truly continuous CTEM program and schedule. Remember, that's continuous threat exposure management.
And we'll be right back.
Adrian, we've talked for 5 episodes now about the shadow, the actors, the tools, the alliances, and the terrifying new laws coming out of China. This feels overwhelming. I don't know about how it feels for you, but it does to me.
So it is Tova, but the shadow's only effective for these agencies, and they can only lurk there if you don't know it's there. The second it's exposed to daylight, which is what we're working very hard to do, it's no longer effective.
Well said. And in our final episode, we're going to talk about that light. We're going to talk about how the West is fighting back. We'll look at zero trust architecture, the naming and shaming campaigns that are actually working, and how AI is being used to catch the ghosts in the grid before they can press enter.
We'll look at the 2026 Cyber Shield initiative, my friend Brett Leatherman, the head of cyber at the FBI, and the roadmap for a world where we no longer just wait for the storm to hit.
So listeners, stay tuned and join us for the episode 6 in the China Threat Actor series, our conclusion of Dragon's Digital Shadow, The Great Defense.
In the meantime, stay safe with SafeBridge.
Bye-bye.
The Cyber Resilience Brief is a Safe Breach podcast. Executive produced by Adrian Culley and Tova Dvorin. Music produced by Sar Dressner. Hosted, edited, and compiled on Riverside. For more about SafeBreach and how you can validate your security controls across your entire IT infrastructure, visit us at www.safebreach.com. That's www.safebeach.com.